Thank you all for coming tonight, and welcome to the fourth event of the 2023-24 Robert B. Church Lecture Series. For those that may not know me, my name is Scotty McDaniel. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Landscape Architecture, and I serve on the College of Architecture and Design's Programming Committee with Julie Kress, Chris Coate, and our chair, Mark Stanley. So as part of this committee, we've been tasked with inviting creative thinkers, creative makers, and creative designers to share their perspectives with our students and faculty. And this year, we've committed to a kind of collective theme of entanglement, creatures, critters, companions, and kins. And tonight I have the honor of presenting Michelle Nijhuis, the author of Beloved Beast, Fighting for Life in the Age of Extinction. We're not fighting for extinction, just to be clear. Yeah, reverse that. Michelle started her, career path in biology from Reed College. She carved out her own sort of direction as a science journalist, leveraging her incredible skills as a storyteller. She writes for many notable publications, including National Geographic, Nature, the New York Times, and the Smithsonian. And some of her noted articles include, there's tons on her website. One that I found interesting was, "Those adorable endangered creatures are not the point." Another, "What can conservation learn from science fiction?" Another, "Stories are waves," and then I'm adding on to what was written, "Bilbo Baggins is a girl," where Michelle defines herself as a co-conspirator and gender-swapping characters from classic tales to create new epic adventures for heroines. Consistent across all of her writing is an ability to really digest and humanize thick concepts that are layered with culture and nature relations, scientific progress, technology as disturbance, political motivations and political underbellies, and shifts in society's consciousness of other species. And so I wanted to invite Michelle, after reading her book, to come here and speak about The Beloved Beast, but also to share her perspective on the role of design in conservation, because I see her as a design ally. As a narrator, she's able to stitch together a network of flawed protagonists and heroic villains that we also claim in our own environmental discourse. Her stories of Aldo Leopold, Gifford Pinchot, and Rachel Carson should really be taken in by all designers, but particularly those committed to knowledgeably intervening on behalf of all species. Flora and fauna, the ugly and the cute, those considered pest and the charismatic. So through untangling the conservation history, Michelle helps us situate many trajectories in ecological thinking and species advocacy that we circulate throughout this building. And so with that as the setup, I'd like to invite Michelle up here to start her lecture, and I'd also like to let everyone know that following this lecture, she will be part of a panel discussion led by our graduate students. So please stick around after the lecture. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Scotty, for that kind introduction. It's really a delight to be here. Thanks in no small part to Scotty McDaniel, who has given me a compressed but really enjoyable and fascinating tour of not only the school, but Knoxville, the history of Knoxville and its multi-layered stories and its surrounding natural beauty. So thanks to all of you for hosting me, and thanks for coming today. And I'm especially glad to talk to an audience of design professionals and design students, as well as those of you from other parts of the campus. I've been saying today that I serendipitously sometimes get to talk to designers, but rarely in a formal context, and I think there's so much that conservationists can learn from designers, and hopefully vice versa. So I really look forward to the discussion after the talk. a little bit about what's next. I am going to give you a very brief history of modern conservation. I hope my book is brief enough to have interested many of you, but in case you haven't read it yet, I'll give you an even briefer history of conservation and talk about some of the accomplishments of the modern conservation movement and some of its, what I think are of as some of its most egregious oversights. I'll talk a little bit about what I see as the shared mission of conservation and design. I won't presume to prescribe a mission for you, but I will presume to prescribe one for conservation. And then future directions for conservation and some opportunities for collaboration that hopefully many of you have thought of. And I hope that we can think of some more in the discussion afterwards. And again, we'll have some discussion, hopefully over pizza and conversation. By way of introduction and by way of introduction to the history of conservation, this is me about 30 years ago now, holding what was then a state-of-the-art GPS unit. Your phone would be a lot more accurate, but we thought this was very cool. So I graduated from college with a degree in biology, which qualified me to be paid minimum wage and work seasonally as a field assistant, mostly in the desert Southwest. So I did this for a few years after college while I was trying to figure out what was next. I really loved these jobs. It was, I met wonderful people. I got to see landscapes I had never encountered before, as well as amazing critters. I caught frogs, I chased tortoises. Sometimes it went well and sometimes didn't. But what I found almost as interesting, or maybe even more interesting, were the politics that surrounded the species that I was studying or helping to study. I lived mostly in very remote small towns, and I was so interested in the fact that I could walk into the coffee shop and eavesdrop on people in front of me in line talking about, ostensibly they were talking about, well, what should we do with this area outside town? Guess what? It's got an endangered species in it. But really, they were talking about, how do we relate to this other species? What's our responsibility? Who pays the cost of protecting a creature that our society as a whole has endangered? These are really profound questions, and it was just endlessly fascinating to me that people were civilly and not so civilly working them out in this context. And that's probably what got me into journalism, because I was interested in science, but I was most interested in how science informed our politics, informed our history, and informed our relationship with these other species. So I started to report on these kinds of controversies, and while I loved reporting, after a while, this narrative became somewhat repetitive. There were always a certain crew of people aligned on one side of the issue, a certain crew of people aligned on the other side. Many of the arguments were the same. Very little progress seemed to be made. And after a while, I started to think maybe history would be helpful because I knew from being an undergraduate in biology, that biologists, and by extension conservationists, since many conservationists come from a science background, we don't get that much education in the history of the movement we plan to join as professionals. We're mostly interested in evolutionary history. We're interested in the emergencies that are right in front of us. We don't spend that much time thinking about history on a human scale. And I knew about some famous conservationists, but I really didn't have the sense of the conservation tradition, how it had changed over time, the lessons that it had learned, the mistakes that it made. So I kept looking for a book like this, never found one, eventually decided I would have to write it. And that became my book, Beloved Beast, it took me a couple of years to write, but really was in gestation for a couple of decades because it was informed by a lot of the reporting I did over the years. So let me make clear here that this is a history of what I awkwardly call the modern conservation movement or the institutional conservation movement. It is not a history of conservation as practiced from the beginning of human history. Of course, societies have practiced conservation on a local level for as long as we know about. And in fact, one of the great oversights of the modern conservation movement is a dismissal or an ignorance of those older practices, and I'll talk about that a bit. But just to make that distinction, I started my history with the realization in industrializing societies in North America and Europe that humans were capable of driving species globally extinct, not just locally extinct. And it may be a little too cute to say that that realization began with the publication of Alice in Wonderland, but in some ways it did. Victorian society, after the publication of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, Victorian society rather abruptly came to the realization that that the British Empire and other colonizing societies had been in the business of driving species extinct for a very long time, actually, for a couple of centuries. In fact, they had driven the dodo. European sailors had driven the dodo extinct a couple of centuries earlier by letting loose a lot of cats and rats and other feral species on the island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. And this was, for centuries, European societies had believed that species were created by God, didn't change over time. There were no new species popped up, and no old species disappeared. So the idea that a puny species like humans could drive species like the dodo extinct really was alarming in Victorian society, and it also really fired up the imagination of people like Lewis Carroll, who is probably a big reason why we even remember the dodo today. So after Victorians came to grips with the dodo, the next shock to the system was to understand that we could drive birds on islands extinct through our economic activities all over the world. We could drive species locally extinct. We could even drive physically large, famously abundant species extinct, like the American bison. And European descended people on the East Coast in the 1800s bought buffalo hides, bought buffalo robes, knew that there was market hunting of buffalo, but it really took a long time for people to come to grips with the fact that that market was capable of driving buffalo extinct. And I tell the story in my book of how buffalo were driven extinct in the wild. There were some buffalo on ranches in semi-captivity, and those animals were used to reestablish the population, but millions and millions and millions of bison were killed, and the species were driven extinct in the span of just a few decades. But this understanding, this realization of how close we came to losing the species was galvanizing to the conservation movement on both sides of the Atlantic. So in my book, there was no way, even by limiting my book to the history of the modern conservation movement, there was no way I was going to tell the history of the whole movement, which is now a global movement. So I followed the story of about a dozen people who I saw as either responsible for or standing at certain turning points in the evolution of the conservation tradition. And what was one of the most satisfying parts of this project was to see how closely some of them work together or were influenced by one another. As I said, most of these people are known. Some of them are less well known than others, but many people, including Rachel Carson, Aldo Leopold, John Muir, and Teddy Roosevelt, have many biographies written about them, so I wasn't introducing them to the world, but what I hoped I was able to do in Beloved Beasts is show how they work together to build this now century-plus long tradition that we're still learning from. So, what good did we manage to do, have we managed to do since 1865 when the dodo shocked us into action? I really felt more optimistic about conservation. I can't say I always feel optimistic, but I felt more optimistic when I finished this book project than when I started it, because I think the historical perspective can be very helpful. When, as I said, conservationists are always facing the next emergency. They know their job is never done. They know that no victory is permanent. But if we look back, we can see that conservationists, the institutional conservation movement, has been successful in protecting the existence of species that we all value today. For instance, we would have very few songbirds. We would have very few, if any, marine mammals. We would have no bison, for sure. So many species that we really appreciate and really cannot imagine our world without, we owe to the foresight of people who saw what their societies were doing and took action, figured out how to take action to constrain those destructive impulses. Raised and sustained public concern about other species. Again, extinction was not even a thing for people back in the 1850s, a long time ago, but not a terribly long time ago, or surprisingly short time ago, I always think. And I think most of us in this room grew up with a familiarity with extinction and a familiarity with endangered species from probably elementary school. We all know that certain species are more vulnerable than others, are in worse shape than others, and that they need our protection. So I think that's a societal, a cultural change and a societal change that the conservation movement is largely responsible for. Created institutions capable of working across political boundaries. This is one that's a little less recognized, and I always think is important because species do not respect political boundaries. We are the only one that does, and even we don't all the time. So I think it's crucially important that we have institutions that can cross political boundaries and work to conserve species in their entire range, across their entire range, whatever that may be. And the conservation movement was responsible for building international institutions like the International Union for the Conservation of Nature that still exist today and are imperfect, but I think their existence is crucially important to the success of conservation. Finally, evolved from an effort to prevent extinction to an effort to protect relationships. So I've talked to some of you today about the need for conservationists to have more literacy in the social sciences and humanities. Many conservationists come from a background in ecology and biology and conservation biology, and I think one of our accomplishments is that we have learned quite well from those traditions, and we have changed our strategies in response. So when William Hornaday, who was a taxidermist who worked at the Smithsonian Institution, got interested in saving the bison and figured out how to put them on a train and take them to the prairie, he was basically treating them like cows. He didn't have an understanding of their role in the ecosystem. He just knew he wanted more buffalo out there. Now we know, and there are tribes and there are nonprofits and all kinds of groups working to accomplish a more complete restoration of the bison because we know what an important role it plays in the prairie ecosystem. So all of those lessons have come to conservation from ecology, and I do think that is one accomplishment of the conservation movement in that it's learned those lessons and it's changed its strategies. It may not have changed its messaging to the public. That's a little further behind. We still talk a lot about single species, but we do think in ecological terms. So the not so good, and I put Teddy Roosevelt up here not to pick on him, but just because this outfit that he has on this photograph was actually taken in New York City. So this outfit he has on kind of epitomizes some of the mixed motives of early conservationists. Roosevelt, like William Hornaday, who I just mentioned, was a wealthy white hunter, a sport hunter, someone who who genuinely admired the species that they pursued, thought they were beautiful, thought they were valuable, thought they had intrinsic value, but also saw the hunt. They saw their pursuit of these animals as important to national pride, to masculinity, specifically white masculinity, which was thought to be quite endangered at the time by office work. So men really needed to get out there and get their blood pumping, chasing a buffalo. And if the buffalo went extinct, men would go extinct. So that was, that was a genuine, I'm laughing a little bit, but it was a genuine social concern at the time. The problem was that there were a lot of people who knew how to hunt for the pot, as it was called. They hunted, for subsistence. Many of them were immigrants to North America or indigenous people. They knew quite a bit about ecosystems, though they may not have put it in those terms because nobody did at the time. They knew a lot about how to ensure how a population would, to ensure that there were enough animals to support a community the next season. But those skills were dismissed by this elite circle of hunters who was part of the first generation of modern conservationists. And I think we're still suffering a bit from those effects today, primarily because the conservation movement, because it came from elite circles, still relies on top-down solutions. So William Hornaday, the taxidermist I mentioned, was a personal friend of Teddy Roosevelt's. When he wanted to protect the bison, he could just say, hey, how about we release them on this grassland that the US just created on land that it stole from the Kiowa people. He didn't have to build a movement from the ground up. And I'll talk about that a little more later. Reinforced conceptual and literal separation of people and quote-unquote nature. Of course, this is just a failing of the English language, I think, and of our culture writ large, that we think of people and nature as two different, separate entities. But I think the conservation movement has really followed and reinforced and not questioned sufficiently that separation, which has led to this idea that, well, nature is something over there. Nature isn't a national park. Nature is not next to us. It's not something we live beside or that we take part in on a daily basis. Finally, learned what other species need to survive, but not how to meet those needs. And this is, I mentioned earlier, the need for more understanding of the social sciences. This is where it's really a vulnerability for us. We have learned from ecology and conservation biology, here's how much space species need to survive. Here's what kind of resources each species might need. Here are the other species that they need to live beside in order to thrive. I mean, these are still active areas of inquiry, and they're changing all the time, but we've got that covered. What we have forgotten for much of our history as conservationists is that conservation is done by people. And we have very little idea of how to persuade or support people in providing species with what they need to survive. We've gotten as far as recognizing that that's a gap in our knowledge. As I said to someone today, we know enough to invite a social scientist to the table, but we don't quite know what to do once they get there. So there needs to be much more dialogue and much more, I think, fundamental collaboration with social sciences, with the humanities, with the arts, if we are to help human beings globally accomplish conservation on a meaningful scale. So one of my favorite quotes from conservation history is from one of my favorite people in conservation history, Aldo Leopold. Many of you may be familiar with him. Founded the profession of wildlife ecology, wrote a book called A Sand County Almanac, which every self-respecting conservationist needs to have under their pillow. But was very prescient and expressed a lot of things in the 1930s, which I think are still relevant today, specifically about the need for what he called a conservation ethic, a need for people, ordinary landowners, ordinary citizens, just to understand how to live alongside nature. But I like this quote because it's kind of prickly, and I think we have a tendency to sort of defang our icons, our cultural icons. You hear about this every Martin Luther King Jr. Day, that Martin Luther King was actually much more controversial during his lifetime than we remember today. So was Aldo Leopold. And this is in one example where he said, there's a feeble minority called conservationists who are indignant about something. They're just beginning to realize that their task involves the reorganization of society rather than the passage of some fish and game laws. And I think we still think that today, basically. Conservationists are still relying on top-down solutions and still forgetting that we have a much more far-reaching mission that we have to accomplish if we are to make conservation happen. He said this in 1934. Not only was that a century ago, but it was at the height of the Dust Bowl. So he was watching ecological catastrophe in real time, and he recognized what a big job lay in front of us. Now, this guy, many of you may recognize, Frederick Law Olmsted. This is in his young, dashing phase. This picture was taken in 1850 when he was on his walkabout in England and writing his first book called Walks and Talks. And I was really heartened and interested to run across this quote via an essay by Billy Fleming, where Garrett Nelson, who retraced Olmsted's steps during those early formative adventures, said Olmsted was a social critic first and a landscape designer second. His aesthetic sensibility was predicated on principles of social reorganization. So he too, like Leopold, recognized that his profession of landscape, what he would come to call landscape architecture, had a much more political and a much more thoroughgoing mission than many people thought, even many of its practitioners thought. So onto our common mission, or what I hope is our common mission. What I would propose, so we're both trying to solve this problem, right? How do we live peaceably? How do people, large numbers of people, high densities of people, live relatively peaceably, sustainably alongside thriving populations of other species? This happens to be the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, actually near Denver, where there is a pretty healthy population of bison. As I said, I won't propose a mission for landscape architecture and design, but I will propose one for conservation to protect, strengthen, and repair the beneficial connections among other species, between other species and their habitats, between humans and other species. We get all that from ecology, but the part we don't pay as much attention to is that we get there by reconnecting humans with one another. And by reconnecting humans of all walks of life with the project of conservation, knowledge that many of us already have in our ancestry, but has been collectively forgotten. So before I wind up, I want to talk about one way in which I see conservation as having moved closer to this mission, and then talk about a couple of ways that I see that landscape architecture and conservation can collaborate. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the expression, the tragedy of the commons. I don't know how many of you have actually seen the paper that made that expression famous, but it was written by an ecologist named Garrett Hardin back in 1968. It was published in Science. I think it's important to point out it was an essay and not a piece of research. Many people think it was research. It was not. Argues that unless shared resources are privatized or controlled by an external authority, tragedy is inevitable in that the resource will be used up. One of the journal's most cited and most requested papers, and there was a study a few years ago looking at how this essay is taught in sustainability-oriented programs writ large, and it's still mostly taught uncritically. The thesis is accepted. The tragedy is inevitable. But even when the paper was published, a young researcher named Eleanor Ostrom, a young sociologist and economist, was pretty skeptical because she had been observing communities, first in the Los Angeles basin and then worldwide, where people had in various ways figured out how to manage the resources, the natural resources they depended on for the long term without resorting to these two solutions that Garrett Hardin had laid out. And she devoted much of the rest of her career to documenting these systems, some of which are centuries old, but she traveled all over the world and talked to researchers all over the world about how these systems worked, and she found common principles by which they operated. She then won the Nobel Prize for economics in 2009, and what she said is what we have ignored. When she won the prize, she said, what we have ignored is what citizens can do. And I think that's a really good watchword for conservation, in that, not that, as I said, international institutions, top-down solutions are important, but we have forgotten the rest of the conservation ecosystem, in that citizens are capable of conservation. The more ownership citizens can take of their conservation practices, of their conservation ethic, the better. And she showed that there is a long tradition out there, largely untapped by the conservation movement, that is waiting to be put into practice. During my research for this book, I had the chance to travel to Namibia, which was an incredibly eye-opening experience, because in Namibia, there is now a national system of community conservation organizations that is based to some extent on traditional practices and is also based on Eleanor Ostrom's ideas of what makes community conservation work. These community conservation organizations have now been in place for about 30 years. There's a lot of detail to go into and a lot of tangled history, but essentially what they accomplish is they devolve a lot of control about the management of local wildlife to communities. And by doing so, by devolving that control, they manage to shift the burdens and benefits of conservation so that some of the benefits of living next to large, occasionally destructive animals is relieved, and some of the benefits of living near healthy populations of wildlife, tourism, for instance, hunting, in another instance, are returned to the community. The community is able to benefit more directly from the outcomes of their conservation practices. So poaching has gone down. Species that were highly endangered before the community conservation movement gained speed have recovered, like the black rhino, which was almost extinct due to poaching and due to just lack of care for habitat and so forth. And there's now a thriving tourism economy in Namibia, which does benefit these community conservation organizations. Most importantly, however, I got to sit in a few of these meetings down here on the right-hand side, and I've sat in a lot of meetings like this over the course of my career where people are talking about the future of wildlife, beginning back when I was working in the Southwest and listening to people fight about conservation. I think that in Namibia marked the first time that I sat in such a meeting, and these were, the people here had far less resources and far less formal education than those in most of the meetings I had attended. That said, this was the first meeting of its kind I'd sat in where I really felt like there was a fundamental agreement of we all want these species to endure, and how are we going to get there? And that to me was just, the meeting was kind of messy that I went to, the most memorable meeting I went to, it was kind of messy, there were arguments, but I stood up and I was just elated, and it took me a minute to realize, well, why am I so happy? And I thought, oh, it's because I've never felt this kind of common cause before. So I think that's what we're going for, and I think the institutional conservation movement can learn a lot from examples like Namibia. And just quickly, so that you don't think that's some boutique example, this is now a movement that's really much more active outside North America than within North America. 80 community conservancies manage almost 40 million acres in Namibia. Australia has a really wonderful constellation of indigenous protected areas that employ indigenous rangers. Canada, the national government has invested a lot of money in indigenous-led conservation, which has existed in various forms for a long time in the modern era, but has now has funding from taxpayers, from the national government, in order to, that's enabling it to be a lot more formal and cover a lot more ground. In the US, there's longstanding tribal-federal cooperation on bison restoration. As I mentioned, the Biden administration has really prioritized tribal co-stewardship, in part because Deb Haaland, the Interior Secretary, is an Indigenous person herself and has brought that perspective to the office. And then the potential is huge. An estimated 50% of the world's land is collectively held de facto, if not de jure, by Indigenous and other local communities. And I think there's so much potential in North America. I live in the West, where there's just an endemic resentment and fear of federal intervention in people's daily lives in much of the rural West, as I've reported on for many years, in Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. And, a lot of that is exaggerated, but there is something to be said for decisions being made by people who really know their local ecosystem. So I think there's a lot of potential for community-led conservation, or at least much more fundamental community participation in conservation. We're coming up on the 50th anniversary of the Endangered Species Act, as some of you may know, and the Endangered Species Act is hated and feared by many people in the West because it's seen as this, big government imposition. And it's a shame because the Endangered Species Act it was never intended to be that way. State governments are really supposed to be doing much of the management of wildlife, which they do, but they have never gotten the funding that the endangered species intended them to have to protect species before they're endangered. So we end up doing this emergency action through the Endangered Species Act, which can feel, and sometimes is, heavy-handed because it's coming in at the last minute when species are very endangered. If we were able to fund, and there are bills now in Congress, one called Restoring America's Wildlife Act, its supporters in Congress from both parties have been trying to pass it for a while. Maybe it'll actually get through, but we don't have a speaker, I heard, so that may be a problem. But there's still hope for it, and I think that has huge potential to depolarize some of the battles over conservation that we see happening. Just some examples of organizations that are really making the connection between these community organizations and global organizations that can, as I said, manage across political boundaries. Finally, opportunities for collaboration, and I hope we can continue this discussion, and I can hear from all of you about what you see as the opportunities. But from my perspective, knowing the conservation movement, what we really need more fluency in and more respect for the importance of the arts, humanities, and social sciences, as I've mentioned a few times, more experience in collaboration, more confidence in collaborative processes. When Garrett Hardin wrote The Tragedy of the Commons, as I said, it was an essay. It wasn't based on research. It was just based on sort of Garrett Hardin's own pessimism. And I think it's easy for us to share that pessimism to some extent because we all experience tragedies of the commons. Like if you've been in a traffic jam, you're experiencing a tragedy of the commons, but it's not inevitable. And I think we need to be reminded, we probably all need to be reminded that we can manage our own resources without resorting to exclusively top-down control or resorting to radical privatization. We can do it. It's hard, but we are capable of it. Again, similarly, more confidence in humans' ability to play a positive role in conservation. Conservationists have assumed for a long time that their job was just to protect people from nature, to draw a boundary of it, kick people out. This led to and continues to lead to a lot of human suffering and displacement, especially in the developing world when the North American and European national park model was just exported wholesale to other countries, and national parks were plopped down in places where people were already living. And more patience in a time of emergencies. We can probably all use this, but I think as the climate continues to change, as our interlocking crises continue to accelerate, it's easy to think, we don't have time for collaboration, we don't have time for discussion. And to some extent it's true, we're getting a late start, but I have come to believe that there really is no way out but through. We need top-down solutions, but we need support for them from all of us who live alongside other species, because there is no way to enforce a law everywhere. We do need, as Aldo Leopold said, a conservation ethic in order to conserve species on a daily basis in practice. Conservationists can offer. As I said, I think one thing we have accomplished is we understand what other species need now. We're starting to understand what they're going to need in the future, even under unpredictable conditions. I think we can help you think about those changing needs and think about those needs in a very specific way, a species-specific way or an ecosystem-specific way, in ways that might be new to you. I think passion for the instrumental and intrinsic importance of other species. About 10 years ago, conservation biologists got in a big internal fight over which was more important, instrumental or intrinsic. And I was always tearing my hair out, or most people involved in this discussion were tearing their hair out thinking, it's both, you guys. And I think it's true. We appreciate that, we appreciate that species have their own value, but they also provide many things that we literally cannot live without. Skill in ecological thinking, thinking like a mountain, as Aldo Leopold would call it. I think we are very comfortable with systems thinking as long as it doesn't include humans. So we can learn that part from you. I think we're very comfortable thinking about ecological systems and how they operate as systems and how they may change in the future. Finally, charm, good looks, and entertaining stories from the field. Though I have to say, I think all ecologists would agree that you guys are much better dressed than we are. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'm going to introduce the panel. So.
Wonderful. Okay. Should I?
Check. Awesome. That was great. Thank you, Michelle, for sharing your work today with us. My name is Dustin, and I'm a student in the School of Landscape Architecture. And over the last month or so, I, along with many other students in the program, have had the opportunity to read and discuss Michelle's book, Beloved Beasts, in preparation for this event. The conversations that have spawned from the reading and developed during the discussions have been influential in my understanding of the conservation movement and challenged my misunderstandings and assumptions. This has led to reflection on what the role of conservation should be in landscape architecture and the immense responsibility and unsettling power that we have as designers who practice within the context of living systems. My hope is that the following conversation can be just as enlightening as reading and discussing Michelle's work has been for me. And if something said on stage inspires a question from the audience, please don't hesitate to raise your hand, and I can bring you a microphone. We want this to be a discussion between the entire room, so please, feel free to interject. And if you enjoyed today's talk, feel free to pick up a copy of Michelle's book from an ASLA representative or the common retailers online you're familiar with. And finally, I'd like to introduce the student panelists for today's talk. We have Abby, Cole, Carlos, and Taylor. Thank you all for being here.
Is that working? Okay. I can get us kicked off. Like Dustin said, we're hoping everyone will have questions and this will be a discussion, but I have a question kind of on terminology. And as we're thinking about the places where conservation and landscape architecture kind of have overlap and collaborate, I was thinking a lot about the distinctions between conservation, preservation, and restoration as a design intervention and something that we're involved in as landscape architects. And you have a brief quote from this last April when you reviewed 2 books, and you used the word fuzziness of ecological restoration, and I really loved that phrase. You have a quote that kind of captures the differences between restoration, conservation, and preservation for people who don't know. Excuse me. So quoting you, where conservation has historically emphasized human management and preservation has aspired to eliminate it entirely, restoration has traveled a crooked path between the 2 traditions, seeking to incorporate the strengths of both. So I'd love for you to expand on the casting of restoration as a crooked path, kind of the idea of its fuzziness, especially in our context, of changing climates and landscapes.
Thanks for that question. And that was I believe that was in a review of a book by Laura Martin, which I recommend to all of you. It's called Wild by Design, and it's a history of restoration. And it really walks alongside my book in that the histories of restoration and conservation are, of course, intertwined, but as she shows, the history of restoration diverges from conservation in some really interesting ways that I did not know about. So by a crooked path, I think I was referring mostly to North American restoration's journey from trying to restore ecosystems to static reflections of a pre-Columbian past to living, evolving systems that are not tied to any single moment in time, especially in light of climate change. I mean, I think this was a source of great consternation in the 80s and 90s when restorationists came to the realization of, oh, geez, you know, maybe if we restore something to a pre-Columbian condition, it's not going to be able to survive because the climate is going to be different. So restoration has evolved because it's asked itself those fundamental questions. And it has, I think, tried to draw the best ideas from preservation and conservation through its history. I think conservationists have a lot to learn from restorationists because they're historically conservationists have had this real fear of we're okay with human management, but we do have a fear somewhat like preservationists. We do have a fear of too much intervention, too much quote unquote playing God. You guys aren't constrained as much in that way, and neither are restorationists. They recognize the need for a positive human role in conservation and the need for a much more sophisticated role in conservation than I think conservation has historically recognized.
I can go next. Still on? Okay. My question has to do a little bit with along the lines of reconnecting humans to one another. And I'm very curious about how your career has spanned more of like the urban-rural divide. And I'm very curious because I know you've kind of spoken a bit in other work that you've done on the tensions between urban experts and local knowledge. And so I'm just curious if you could speak a bit on how you've navigated these dynamics and maybe just any examples of successes in terms of like conservation in those areas, or like the tensions between those two things, those two dynamics, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very active area of discussion, I think, in conservation, in particular, how to legitimately and responsibly incorporate indigenous knowledge into conservation. There's an acronym called TEC, which is horribly unuseful. It's traditional ecological knowledge, but of course we have to make it sound like a 1980s programming language. So I think conservation has historically been not great at, as I've talked about, because we're so focused on top-down solutions. We've been not great at incorporating local knowledge and traditional and expert knowledge. And I think I see some of the consequences of that because I've lived in small Western towns for most of my life, and I've witnessed, some of this really toxic resentment sometimes explodes into violence of occasionally indigenous people, but often rural white people who see their knowledge, which is occasionally reaches back many generations, their just understanding and familiarity with the landscape being ignored or being condescended to because the experts know best. So as far as success stories, I'm like identifying all the problems. Success stories are, I think, difficult to find, but I think there's growing interest in them, and I think the indigenous-led conservation movement is really showing the way, where they're like, look, we're not going to bother with this tech thing, whatever that is, whatever traditional ecological knowledge is. We're just going to start restoring species on our ancestral land and show you guys how it's done. and I think that is a real source of hope in the larger conservation movement, because there's a real recognition of, oh, wow, there's all this capacity that's untapped and that we can all really benefit from. And then I hope that example, those successful examples, bison is probably the most prominent one, but there are many others on a more localized scale. I hope that inspires more effective and more meaningful local consultation or local leadership, even better.
So a lot of the conservationists you just talked about and who you profile in Beloved Beasts are grounded in their own personal land practices, like Aldo Leopold, who grew up hunting with his father and then lived on a homestead later on in his life. And I'm just curious how your experiences off the grid informed your approach to formulating these narratives and how it's impacted your own practice as a writer and scientist.
Yeah, so I lived, I'm laughing because Joe Williams, who's a professor here at the university, is his family, members of his family were my neighbors in Colorado when I lived off the grid. So I lived off the grid in a small straw bale house, which was solar powered. We had telephone and various mod cons, but it was I suppose by many standards, a pretty radical way to live. I think what it taught me, and what living in a very rural place for many years taught me, was more about just an awareness of where everything comes from. Because I lived in a coal mining valley. At least there were active coal mines when I lived there. It was the headwaters of a tributary of the Colorado. It was a fruit growing, still is an agricultural valley. So I lived alongside people who mined coal, people who thought a lot about how much water there was going to be over the summer and whether there was enough to do what they needed to do to keep their business running. All those things, I think, gave me an awareness of limits, just like it gave me an awareness of limits to wake up on a winter morning and see the battery level in our house batteries go like this and not be able to dry my hair. And I think that has benefited me because I in ways that I'm still figuring out, but I think that awareness it's now ingrained in me and informs my writing.
Well, my question's a little simpler. Sorry. I'm very interested in the topic of community-based or led conservancies. I read a chapter of your book that spoke specifically about Namibia and the rhino and such. I think it was chapter 8. It was really interesting. And one thing that concerned me was the use of the term trophy hunting. Yeah. And so I wanted to hear your thoughts on whether the term alone should change and should that be an approach that we could take as a social structure to move forward. Yeah.
Yes, I'm sure we should change the term trophy hunting. It's gross. And so I do have a section about so-called trophy hunting because the community conservancies in Namibia do occasionally allow someone, usually from overseas or from Europe, to pay tens of thousands of dollars, in some cases hundreds of thousands of dollars, to shoot an animal that the community has decided and the national government has decided is very old, past its reproductive age, maybe causing problems of some kind in the community. In one case, there was a rhino that was actually past reproductive age and also interfering with younger rhinos' access to females, kind of a problem. And they have made the decision that, look, we're going to allow, if you want to come and like relive your colonial fantasy in Namibia and pay us more than the community conservancies collectively make in a year to do it, we'll take that deal. And the people I spoke to about this were very articulate about, look, to prevent us from doing so is another form of colonialism. And I found that very persuasive. And I mean, you'll see people on Facebook battle practically to the death over the evils of trophy hunting. And there are some places where it's abused, don't get me wrong. And it's certainly not a tradition I would like to see last forever. I was as grossed out by pictures of the Trump brothers holding these beautiful jaguars overhead as anybody else. But I'm persuaded by what I heard in Namibia about the utilitarian value of these hunts for larger conservation efforts, larger long-term conservation efforts, when there is a robust system of community conservancies that are managing it.
Do we want to take a break to see if anyone in the audience? Yeah, we don't want to pause. It's okay if not. We can keep going.
So just on the topic of like moving, I guess, past the topic of the trophy hunting, are there other counterintuitive strategies for conservation that you have examples of or that we wouldn't normally think about?
Counterintuitive strategies. I know I'm going to think of 1,000 after after my chance to tell you about them has passed. But yes, I think that there are opportunities to more actively manage populations that we shy away from because they make us uncomfortable for various, very legitimate reasons. I'm thinking specifically about efforts to kill invasive species on a large scale in Australia and New Zealand. And there's a movement called compassionate conservation that argues that large-scale killing of invasive species really just, because of its effect on us as a society, it kind of makes us perhaps callous to the welfare of other species, or it just kind of brutalizes us as a society, that we shouldn't do it. And I tend to think we should do it with more thought and perhaps do it with more sadness. I mean, no one should be going out and celebrating, the slaughter of millions of animals, no matter how much of a problem they pose to other species. But I do think there is something unethical about our saying, well, previous generations created this problem, but the most effective solution just makes us too uncomfortable, so we're not going to do it. I think we may have to bear that burden, but we can bear it with perhaps a little more awareness than we bear it now.
So something else that I was thinking about when I was kind of thinking about the overlap between what landscape architects do and the work that you do is something that we do a lot in school and that firms do a lot in projects, is considering how to frame narratives about projects and telling stories of sites. It's a significant part of our education and a part of landscape architecture practice since its inception, really. And so I'm curious what you have learned in your career about effective narrative and effective storytelling, and how that has evolved in your career and your work with High Country News and as a journalist. And yeah, I'd be curious to hear.
Well, I have to say, just as an aside, I think conservationists can learn so much from the studio model that we spend a lot of time, I think, trying to gain legitimacy as scientists, because physicists think we're just, I don't know, they don't think we're scientists. We're not quantitative enough. So I think historically we've spent a lot of time trying to gain legitimacy in that way, when really we could use, we need to have our ideas and our assumptions shaken up in the ways that the studio model does. So I was kind of daydreaming about that today. But yes, I think I've learned a lot more about narrative as a journalist than I ever did as a wannabe conservationist or as an observer of conservation. And I think the biggest thing I've learned is, and I was talking about this earlier today, is being conscious of your audience and being conscious of the audience that you want to reach, not the audience you want to impress, because they're often different. And when I often talk to scientists about communicating with a broader public, and my counsel is, and I speak from experience in this because journalists have their own, we are self-conscious as well, but we want to impress our peers, we want to impress our editors, but I think scientists often want to impress their colleagues, and they're afraid of seeming unserious if they use perhaps less, they're just as accurate, but they use less precision, or they're less formal in their language. But that's what your audience, if you're trying to reach a broader audience, if you're trying to tell a compelling narrative, that's what your audience is going to appreciate. So what do they need, not what do you need from your imagined audience?
Thanks. Okay. Yeah, thanks. Just wanted to follow up on the narrative point, and I was thinking back to two things in your talk. One was the Lewis Carroll story and the image with the Lewis Carroll story, and then the other one was the Teddy Roosevelt image that you described really vividly. And I was just thinking, that designers are good at making images, and they're good at telling stories, and those may be, chief among our skills, but then we have a hard time sometimes finding agency or finding kind of landing points, meaningful landing points for those with actual, what we might call actual agency, like conservationists, for instance. So just wondering, like, about the power of having images or crafting images, and the power of telling projective stories or projecting possible futures. And if there's any, like, do you see room for that in a more direct way, direct agential way, with governance or with some other form of agency that I can't think of right now?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I can speak to that maybe more as a journalist than as someone coming from ecology, because I think it's true. I mean, I think I brought up Lewis Carroll. I almost said Lewis and Clark, different guys. In slightly tongue-in-cheek, but the figure of the dodo, I think, really did cement the idea of extinction in the popular imagination. And, Teddy Roosevelt was responding to other images he had seen as a boy of cowboys and Indians in the Wild West. And, Rachel Carson, though she didn't really work in images, she painted her writing is still so vivid. Painted images and words of what might happen, what our possible future could happen without action. So I think, there is a lot of power in images, visual images and other kinds of images. But again, I think it's a question of audience, who I think, and the right audience may not be the biggest audience, right? Like who holds the levers of power, who's making the decisions, and what might connect, what might they respond to? And I think that's the gap that conservation is trying to close, just like you say design might be trying to close. It's thinking more specifically about what kind of language, what kind of images might lead those more precisely defined audiences to action. Because it's easy for me as a journalist just to be like, oh, well, if I reach 1 million people, surely things will change. And, so I've written for many sizes of audiences, and I can tell you there are magazines that I won't name that have millions of subscribers, and people will say, I saw your article in the dentist office, which is a little depressing. But I write for a publication like High Country News, which covers public land issues in the American West. Many, many fewer subscribers, but many of them are practitioners. So if I tell a story to them, I know that they're going to engage with it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Are you able to hear me okay? Or is this on? Okay, cool. Directly in my mouth? Okay. So I just had a quick question about the part of your talk where you were talking about the separation of man and nature and like the construct of nature. And I was wondering how you felt about projects that try to bridge that divide through education. So things like zoos and aquariums, or even like educational reform initiatives, things like the Highline Project in New York that are doing like urban renewal.
I feel great about those initiatives. I got to visit, thanks to Scotty, I got to visit the Tremont Institute yesterday, and I was really encouraged by just these simple but what seemed like really powerful ways of talking to kids about ecosystems and ecological processes in ways that seemed a lot more sophisticated than I remember from my own education, and just this emphasis on relationships and people as being a participant in those relationships that I don't remember getting a lot of as a kid. And I think that reflects some progress in the conservation movement and some progress in environmental education. I think we have a long way to go, of course. I think the English language continually frustrates me in this way, because it's just every time you use the word nature, it's a convenient word, but every time you use it, you sort of reinforce the separation. So I don't know if anyone has better ideas. I'd love to hear them. Maybe we'll change it tonight. But yeah, I think we're slowly learning, or maybe remembering what we know.
I had a question, but I think you might have just given a portion of an answer to it. I don't know if people can hear me. Oh, okay, awesome, cool. I can just say it anyway, but I've been thinking a lot about some of the examples where you're mentioning there are people that are defiant, right, and actively trying to stop certain conservation efforts. And then you've got a group of people that are pretty complacent. We have other things that are just like more priorities for our life. Even though I would argue that, conservation and, stewardship should be a priority for all of us, because it's very intricately interwoven with just our life cycles, right? And our life ways. And then I feel that there's a group, and it could be, the younger generations coming up that are part of that kind of shifting baseline, like that idea that the world that they know now is just okay. It's the world that they're in, right? And so when we're thinking about conservation, preservation, restoration, all of this, of looking back, and I'm curious, how do we reach, and again, it probably is through education, all of the examples you just gave, but how do we stoke the imagination around abundance and diversity for all sorts of living systems, for those who don't really know any better?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for that. Yeah, many thoughts, but let me pick out a couple. I love history. We're not done with the past. I think we have so much to learn from history, not least in helping us avoid repeating our mistakes, but also to give us ideas for the future. But I do think we can make the mistake of presenting conservation as a sort of nostalgic enterprise. We're trying to get back to something like restoration we were talking about. We're trying to get back to this lost world that, gosh, sorry kids, you're born too late to experience. That's not appealing. And in fact, one of my sort of secret hopes for this book was that secret motivations for this book was that I did see a lot of kids of my daughter's generation. She's 15 now. My daughter's generation and slightly older, who were really concerned about climate change, but really just thought of conservation as, at best something that their parents were concerned about, and at worst something that was like actively racist or actively oppressive, because it has these reprehensible characters in its history. And so my hope was to say, oh no, this is still like a living tradition that that everyone can contribute to. And if we solve the climate crisis, we haven't solved the biodiversity crisis. Like, sorry, we need to work on both. Both are important. So I think presenting it as a more active undertaking that is future facing, as I think it should be and needs to be, even though it can be informed by the past, is helpful. And I think repressing what may be, speaking of narratives, as Mark was saying, repressing what might be our own instinct as educators to deliver an elegy or, talk about how much better it used to be. That's I think what gives conservation its reputation as like something that's boring or depressing. Often people will say, "Oh, how can you cover that so depressing?" I'm like, "Well, now I'm really depressed."
I just was wondering if you could comment at all to this like new movement of reintroducing species to like lands that they have been taken away from. I know that like there's some critiques that like a lot of times when these species are being reintroduced to an ecosystem that used to exist in, that like the ecosystem is almost shocked to it because they haven't been there for so long. Or like also like when these species are reintroduced, they're like so tagged that they're not necessarily wild anymore, or yeah.
So there are a lot of great stories about successful reintroductions. Reintroductions of large mammals tend to get all the attention, but there are a lot of like sort of more modest, more local introductions of smaller species that have been quite successful. They are not easy, and they can be very politically controversial. But I think there's a lot of evidence they can work. They can work politically, they can work ecologically if thoughtfully done. As far as being a shock to the system, I think, if you're talking about, there's a lot, in my opinion, too much talk about de-extinction, which is creating a hybrid species of a very, very long extinct species and bringing it back into an ecosystem. That's where you might get, just because of our own limited knowledge, like it becomes impossible to predict how an ecosystem is going to respond to a species that has not been home to for millennia. There's just no way we can know. We can do a little better job of predicting what's going to happen if we're talking about decades. And I think, the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone and into the rest of the West shows us that there can be great ecosystem benefits even if a species has been absent for 70 years or so. And then as far as tagging and whether or not that species is wild, that is a fascinating discussion. I think I'll just say it's worth asking. It's worth asking whether knowing exactly where the animals go makes them a little less wild. I don't have a strong opinion about it. I can see both sides of that argument.
Hi. Yeah, I just want to share my appreciation for how you've been able to describe each character through their accomplishments and their flaws and their trajectories, and the way that you've connected each character via the chapters. It just makes you feel like it makes you wonder about how you can reach a person, and I think your story or your book definitely can do that, and what you've just been saying is really interesting. And I feel like you've been able to go outside of yourself to talk about all these different narratives and how they've shaped history. And I'm wondering your thoughts on how we can go outside of ourselves to think about like the women, the minor characters that play a role in conservation. Just because I feel like sometimes we're so enamored by these hero trajectories and stories. How do we go beyond the single person narrative and talk about the multitudes of these other peoples that are also influencing the movement?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. It's something I think about a lot as a journalist because editors, who I do edit for a living sometimes, so I know and love editors, and I appreciate many editors I've worked with over the years, but often they will say, do you have a main character? And so I think journalism is very stuck in the great man theory of history, even though the profession of history may have moved on. The strategy I settled on for this book, even though it is told mostly through white men, because white men were, for better and so often worse, were the leaders of the conservation movement, and I felt like I wanted to follow their ideas. I hoped to get away from that model by showing how they depended on other people, and both, they depended on the leaders that had come before them, but they also depended on other people in their lifetimes to come up with their ideas, and to show a little more of the ecosystem of the conservation movement rather than attributing it just to one person. But I still I think there is so much more room for us to innovate as writers and storytellers in telling stories of movements, broader movements, grassroots movements that still allow us to connect with people individually. So how do we tell a story of a movement that doesn't privilege any, one individual or any small set of individuals, any elite circle, but still gives us a way to reach into the past or to reach across the world and feel that we are emotionally involved? I don't have the answer to that, but I would love to hear ideas.
So there was another question just about the unextinction or whatever the term was, but I was reading about something pretty novel the other day regarding, I think it's Florida torreya, which is a very, very endangered species of conifer in Florida, where all of its adults have been wiped out, and through domesticated specimens, they've brought the seeds, and tried to replant them, and they found that it's pretty difficult and it has a low success rate, so they were planting them outside of the native range as a form of conservation to try and keep the species alive because of climate change and things like that, altering its actual native range and making it inhospitable. And I was just wanting to know, or if you had any thoughts about that, like if the risk and reward is, a good enough ratio to justify doing that.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I've actually spent some quality time with Florida torreya, both in its native range where you can hardly find it, and it's not doing very well when you can find it. I remember I went out with a couple people who had in the panhandle of Florida, and we found these little tiny sprouts. But you can see healthy Florida torreya at the Biltmore Estate on the grounds, and where they're doing quite well. So there's this idea that if they were planted in greater abundance further north, that might protect the species going into the future. And so this is called assisted migration sometimes, and I think it can sometimes be caricatured like, oh, we're going to do something ridiculous like move species en masse, further north to protect them. I think we actually have been practicing assisted migration in wildlife management, especially in fisheries management, for decades now. We have moved species around a lot, sometimes to ill effect, but often they do just fine. So I think it's an interesting, it has led to a lot of interesting ethical debate, but some of it is, I think, a bit over dramatized. I think if we did see a population blinking out in the southern edge of its range, I think probably the instinctive response of most conservationists would be, okay, we've got this habitat left, let's maybe cultivate or supplement that population. If we can push it a little further north, we might do that, but we're going to do that thoughtfully. So I don't think many people are proposing assisted migration in the radical form that it's sometimes caricatured as, if that makes sense.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to just ask a brief question about something that you spoke about, the words you chose and the conservationist need. Thinking, is this okay? Oh, yeah. Okay, I'll try and speak louder. So you talked about confidence in collaboration and confidence in the positive input of humans. And and more patience, and these seem like very soft skills as you're talking about for this need for interdisciplinarity and kind of this working back and forth between city and land that Abby mentioned earlier. And so I was just wondering if you've seen any examples of this or conversations that almost got to this point of kind of reaching a common ground where there is like a vision of like positive impact of humans. I know you mentioned those in Namibia as well, but even in the U.S., in the Southwest, where there is this kind of divide debate. And yeah, just speaking a little bit about these soft skills as well as like for conservationists as well as in other fields as well, potentially as designers too.
Yeah, we definitely need soft skills. A lot of conservationists got into conservation because they loved animals, and they sometimes liked animals better than people. And then they unwittingly entered a profession where they have to talk to people all the time. So I have a lot of empathy for that. And I have a friend who's worked for the Nature Conservancy for many years, and he says it should be called conversation biology, because that's what it is. So I see I see a lot of that, and it is confidence and faith in the value of collaboration, because we don't have a lot of evidence for its success in our daily lives or when we read the newspaper, or there's many examples of it going wrong. But I think to believe that it's possible, I see that happening actually in the land trust movement a lot, because people are working with private landowners, often working across jurisdictional boundaries to make things happen, and they're seeing how people can work together. I think that you as designers, as design professionals and architects, probably have a lot of lessons in collaboration to teach us, because you are, but just the nature of your profession means that you have to collaborate with a lot of people with different skill sets and probably conflicting interests. And we need to do that, but we don't, it's not assumed, I think, in our education that we're going to be spending a lot of time doing that. We spend a lot of time learning about ecological models and things like that, and far less time, even collaborating with one another throughout our education. So there's hope, and there are examples, but we need more formal training in it.
So conservation has relied pretty heavily on the use of charismatic species in landscapes. So, the panda or the elephant or the rainforest really motivate the movement of money and effort. But things like the desert and mosquitoes aren't really as well liked. And I do understand that there's like a political component to this at times. But how do conservationists consider this and address this friction in their work?
Yeah, we were talking about this a bit at lunch today. I mean, I think there's short-term value in depending on charismatic endangered species. Large conservation organizations have, the World Wildlife Fund has a panda for its logo, and large conservation organizations are forever raising money off, very rare, very charismatic endangered species. Sometimes to the point where the rarity itself becomes part of the charisma. People, I think, get so emotionally attached to these very sort of perceived to be fragile species, often on the other side of the world. So I don't begrudge conservation organizations for taking this strategy. They need money. But I really wish I saw a little more risk-taking in the communication of these very large groups, and that they took a risk on people's ability to understand that conservation was about more than that, right? Like, it's about protecting where we live. It's about protecting the systems that support us. And it's also about protecting, the beautiful, exotic species, some of which may live quite close to you and you may not realize it because they're too tiny or you don't run into them. Let us see the project of conservation in all its variety and see if perhaps that works too. That's my hope. That's my prescription for, some of these organizations that I get mailings from all the time.
So one thing I know we deal with as people, especially in the political sphere, is like we're constantly bombarded with issues that we get this like indifference sometimes. So I understand the need for needing to speak of us as a part of nature and not as a separation, like really emphasizing these connections and the whole overall. But how do we do that in a way where we're not creating this like overwhelming ambivalence of the whole?
How do we get across the complexity of conservation without just making people feel like, oh, the problem is everywhere, we have to deal with everything?
To the lay person, yes.
Yeah. Right. I mean, I think there is this, you know, we all have shorter and shorter attention spans these days, and there is this danger of like, oh, I guess it's just complicated. You know, I guess there's no urgency. It's just complicated. Forget it. You know, I'm going to go watch Netflix, which I do recommend when it's needed. It's a good question, and I think it's a question. It's a matter of choosing audiences, right? So, you know, I'm working on a story for National Geographic about the monarch butterfly. If all goes well, it'll be out in January. And there, you know, I am relying on a charismatic species, but I hope in the final version, if no one's cut it while I've been gone, you never know what's going to happen in the kitchen there. That it gets across some of that complexity, but in a dose that audience, which is quite general, can digest or is willing to digest when they're reading National Geographic. You know, they're experts in other fields, but when they're reading National Geographic, they're a generalist, and they're not going to have a lot of patience for like, woo, it's really complex. But for more specialized audiences, you can you know, say, okay, let's stop for a minute and let's really think about how complicated this is, and then let's get focused and let's think about what that complexity tells us about what we should do next. You know, and then you can break it down into more specific pieces of advice.
Thank you. I believe we have time for one more question if the audience would like anyone to take it. No.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Michelle, thank you so much for being with us tonight. This has been a really awesome talk and conversation with all of you. Yeah, I think any other thoughts? No? Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. It's really a delight to be here. So thanks to everyone who's hosted me today, especially Scotty.
That was so fun. The back and forth.
I know, it's like